My name is Vivek Chillicurry. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I study international affairs and with a concentration in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. I'm glad you guys could all be here this morning, and it's good to know that no once-in-a-century Franklin storm can stop the CPL from doing what we do best, which is bring interesting people like Mr. Thomas to talk about fascinating subjects in the study of leadership. So you guys aren't here to hear me talk, so let me tell you what I'm really here for, which is to introduce our special guest, Mr. Evan Thomas, and moderator, David Gergen. As you guys know, Evan Thomas is here to talk about his new book, Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World. So if that title doesn't get you interested, I don't know what title would. But, of course. This is his 8th book. He's written about President Roosevelt. His book in 2010, The War Lovers, was about President Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and the rise of the American Empire following the Spanish-American War. He's also written a personal favorite of mine, a biography of Robert Kennedy, which came out in 2000. He's a leading commentator and has a long and distinguished career in journalism, mostly in Newsweek and Time. He served as their Washington bureau chief for many years. Up until 2010, he served as an editor-at-large. And then he stepped down in 2010 to head over to Princeton to serve as a professor of journalism. It's good to welcome him back to Cambridge because he is an alumnus of Harvard College. And he also is a graduate of UJ Law School before he went off to Princeton in New Jersey. So we're glad he was able to make it over here and escape most of the storm's damage. And I'd also like to introduce David Gergen, who really doesn't need much of an introduction around here. He is the director of the Center for Public Leadership and a professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. He has the distinction of having served under 4 administrations, Democratic and Republican, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and President Clinton. He's going to be moderating this event with a lot of hard-hitting questions, as we're used to seeing him on CNN. And with that, I want to first make sure that we give our publisher of this book a big round of applause because Little Brown and Company has provided all the guests with 40 books. We have more than 40 people, so you guys can figure out how that works later. But we want to make sure we give them a big round of applause and appreciate what they've been able to provide. And also to thank David Gergen and, of course, Evan Thomas for joining us this morning in a conversation about Dwight Eisenhower's presidential leadership.
Thank you. We have a couple of guests here today. Evan, I'll leave it to you to introduce your spouse.
My editor spouse.
Your editor and spouse.
Who I met in civil procedure class in law school, which is why you should go to law school.
We have 2 lawyers here.
That's interesting. I met my spouse, Ann, who's over here in law school. Well, there you go. There you go. Okay. And I also wanted to introduce Susan Hopfield, who is here. Susan is spending this year at the Kennedy School. She has just stepped down as president of MIT, where she was a terrific president and had her roots back in Yale, but as a scientist who came here, and we're so delighted, Susan, you're here. She has an interest in leadership, among other things. So we're here to talk about Eisenhower, the leader, and Evan's book. I would note there are 2 other books that I want to mention. One is one I would recommend to you. What introduced me to Evan Thomas was the book The Wise Man. It was one that he co-authored with Walter Isaacson some years ago. It has been republished, I noticed, in the last year. And it's, I think, the finest book about that generation of the people who were the Dean Achesons and Harrimans and others that has ever been written. It's a really wonderful read, too, as is his new book on Eisenhower. Evan is also involved in a project at the moment, sort of on again, off again, it's not taking a whole lot of his time, but trying to write electronic books about this campaign. So maybe before the end of the day, before we leave here, he might give us some thoughts about where we're headed in the campaign. I've already got a couple of questions on that, but for the moment, and for now, because President Eisenhower was one of the most interesting figures who is not well understood by the modern generation, a young generation of anybody I know, and I'm just so delighted to read this book. Evan, why don't you tell us about the book and the central thesis?
Well, the title is Ike's Bluff, and 2 things about Ike. One, he was a good poker player. He learned at West Point when he got a football injury, and he was such a good poker player that he had to quit. because he was taking too much money from his fellow officers and it was hurting his career. But he never forgot how to bluff. The other important thing about Ike is that he really knew war. Not interestingly in combat. The great war hero of World War II was never in combat. He was in World War I, he was training troops stateside. In this World War I, to his great chagrin. World War II, he was way too important and knew too much to put into combat. But he went to a lot of battlefields, more than anybody else, while they still stank of death and the carnage. And he flew in a small plane in 1945 from Berlin to Moscow, flying low over the paths taken by first the German army and then the Russian army, and he saw not a single building standing as they passed over the Ukraine all that way. And he had as only a real soldier can, he had a real hatred of war. So as chief executive, he was damned if he was going to get the United States into a war, any war. We just got nuclear weapons. These fantastically, in fact, this is a grandiose statement, but true nonetheless. Dwight Eisenhower was the first person in the history of civilization with the power to reckon. Because as he became president, the Soviet Union and the United States were amassing these arsenals. When he came into the Oval Office, there was a report in his drawer written by J. Robert Oppenheimer that said we've reached the age of what they call nuclear plenty. This charming bureaucratic term that means that we can, well, as Oppenheimer put it, the United States and the Soviet Union will soon be like two scorpions in a bottle waiting to sting each other to death. Among other decisions that Eisenhower had to confront right away was to do a preemptive strike on Russia to wipe them out before they could wipe us out. Talk about threshold decisions as a president. But his hatred of his realization that we couldn't get into nuclear war, but his equally strong realization that he didn't want to get into any war, that little wars lead to big wars. In Eisenhower's experience and in his reading, you cannot control war. A lot of politicians think you can, limited war, flexible response. A lot of politicians believe compromise, you can do halfway things, you can do half a war. Eisenhower did not believe this. And so his only alternative was to bluff with nuclear weapons. That's really what he was doing for 8 years. He didn't want to get into any war at all, but he had global communism to deal with. If you looked at a map in 1953, it's turning red. Eastern Europe, Asia, you have every reason to believe that communism was on the march, so he's not a pacifist. He's got to do something. What he does is basically he bluffs. Interestingly, he does not send a single U.S. soldier into combat. After he gets us out of Korea in 1953, not a single U.S. soldier into combat. No other president can make that claim since him. Somehow he gets the economy, keeps it strong, balances the budget. Remarkable executive as a records and chief executive, overlooked at the time, less so now.
That's very interesting. I want to look at a couple of things about the poker and how that related to the bluff. What was striking in the book is how you wrote that he not only liked poker, but then he continued to play bridge. He liked to play bridge almost, every couple, 2 or 3 days. He called in his friends. His friends would come gather. But he liked it not just because he enjoyed the downtime, but it was a way to read men's minds, and that he very, very much believed that card playing was a way to understand the intentions and that relates to the bluff.
Absolutely. I mean, Andy Goodpaster, his aide, talked about this a lot in his oral histories. And in bridge, you have a partner who can signal you by the cards. I mean, it's all very subtle. They can't tell you what they got or where they're going, but by the way they bid, you can sort of tell where they're going. And he's constantly reading his own partner, and in poker, he was always reading his competitors. And he did this in his human interaction. He disliked using the telephone. He wanted to see people face to face whenever he could in the Oval Office, not over the phone, because he understood that they studied this now. 90% of human communication is nonverbal. It's body language. It's if you believe blink. It's all sort of done in an instant. And Eisenhower intuitively understood this and was always trying to read the people he was dealing with, including his principal adversary, Nikita Khrushchev, who was a dangerous remote figure full of bluster, constantly threatening. Khrushchev said, "We will bury you," to the West. I mean, nothing subtle about that. Always talking about how he was cranking out rockets like sausages out of Russian factories. It wasn't actually true, but they claimed it. So Eisenhower made sure that he got two shots face to face so that he could take the measure.
I was going to say, so he used diplomacy in part to take measures.
He did.
And to understand what he was saying. He had to have some way to figure out whether his bluffs were going to work.
He did. Now, a lot of this is intuitive and guesswork. The thing about it, he operated on all levels. For instance, he had a very elaborate planning process. The White House, in fact, the Kennedys, when they came in, thought the Eisenhower planning process was boring and sclerotic and ossified because there were more damn committees. But what the Kennedys missed, and Eisenhower actually did not do a good job of explaining, was that Eisenhower had all this planning process so that he could then ignore it. He used this expression from von Moltke, who was the Prussian chief of staff in the 1890s, that planning is everything, plans are nothing. It's a cousin of this military idea that as soon as you have contact with the enemy, all plans go out the window. So Eisenhower planned like hell, but knowing perfectly well that most of his plans would go fluey, and operating always, and he was a equal participant in his own planning. He wasn't just standing aloof from it. He'd go to the national security meetings, cabinet meetings. He would change sides. He would jump right. You read the minutes, as you can, of the National Security Council meetings. Eisenhower was all over it, arguing both sides of the question. His own staff often didn't know where he really was. I'm not sure he knew where he really was. But the other quality he had was patience. He never decided anything until he absolutely had to. And so he would vigorously participate in his planning process, and then if he had to, ignore its results. He was also involved in channels through emissaries.
But yeah, let's tease out some of that these leadership aspects, because it was. I found that you made it very clear that the Eisenhower that the public saw, was a genial man who seemed to be above it all, sort of grandfatherly and enormously likable. The single most effective political button in history, more effective than any other buttons have been used through a lot of time, was simple buttons with this picture on it saying, and smiling on it saying, I like Ike. And apparently it was just worth lots and lots and lots of votes. And people saw that this man they were enormously drawn to because he was genial, they trusted him, and so forth. They thought that he was a very kind, compassionate man. And yet, underneath this, he was cold-blooded as hell. Tell us about that.
He was, and it was amazing that he was able to, for 8 years, basically make most of the American people believe that he was this genial golf playing guy. It sort of haunted him in history because he was written off as a genial golf player. It was only when the scholars got in the archives starting in the 1980s that they saw, oh my God, there's a whole different Eisenhower we didn't know about. Fred Greenstein, a professor of political science at Princeton, coined a famous expression, the hidden hand. And what Greenstein got into Eisenhower's secretary's files and found that Eisenhower was doing all sorts of stuff behind the scenes that nobody knew about. I got my direct exposure to this was I spent a lot of time with John Eisenhower, who was Dwight Eisenhower's son, now 90 years old, wonderful guy. Elsie and I had lunch with him several times. And young John Eisenhower, age 90, was always trying to figure out Dad. Imagine being Dwight Eisenhower's son. The first line of John Eisenhower's memoir is, sometimes I think I was born standing at attention. Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter, said that Eisenhower was always lecturing the grandkids on deportment, and she would be sitting there slumped over teenager and he was behind with his giant hands straight in the back. So, pretty intimidating father to have. So, John is still trying to figure out Dad after all these years. And we're talking about this balance between the genial, sunny, warm Ike and the cold-blooded Ike. And I'm saying, 50-50. John Eisenhower says, make that 75% cold-blooded. That's the son about the father. And he loved his father. It's not that he did. He had a loving relationship with his father. But he was also worked in the White House. John Eisenhower, Major John Eisenhower, was the deputy to Eisenhower's staff secretary, Andy Goodpaster, handling the top secret stuff, the nuclear stuff, intelligence, all the really scary stuff. John is in the room.
So tell us, in an age when we put a great stress upon authenticity among leaders, how to think about the surface leader versus the internal leader.
What a great riddle and a trap of a question, because I'm a big authenticity guy. I'm always saying, our leaders ought to be more authentic. I totally defies that, because he's actually two people. He is, And I think it's the other thing that makes it complicated. He's not faking it. I think he's sincerely warm. The half that's sort of this 25% that's warm and genial, totally sincere. I think it was a warm smile, and he was friendly and affable and great to hang around with. Had a million friends. His buddies from West Point like to come up and tell old stories. And that was all real. And the American public, I think, has good radar for this stuff. I think they do. I think they can sort of see through the TV set and judge people. They judged him to be a decent guy because he was a decent guy. He had good Kansas values. He grew up in the Midwest, poor kid, turn of the century, strict parents. I mean, he had good values. I think he was a good guy. But it is also true, as his vice president, Richard Nixon, said about him. Nixon said in his own memoirs, he said, Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, is a more complex and devious man than most Americans realize. And Eisenhower added, Nixon added, I mean devious in the best sense of the word. And he was devious, but somehow, I know this sounds impossible, but that's not contradictory. Some great figures have this capacity to be both, to be genuinely principled, honorable, decent. I think not faking it, and when necessary, expedient, cold-blooded, sack people if they have to. And of course, in Eisenhower's case, send hundreds of thousands of young men to their death. Remember, he's Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. He's sending whole armies to their deaths. He is ordering the bombing of cities. He has a lot of experience with responsibility on a scale that most of us can't imagine. I think there are probably some military people in this room who do have some feel for this. But the rest of us civilians just can't imagine what it's like to do that. So he's had to live in a place that most people have never lived before. And I think maybe that helps explain this compartment. Sometimes when you need to be cold-blooded, you are.
Well, it was interesting when Nan Cohen came here after she had 2 college presidencies. Susan, before it's over, I hope we can draw you into this. She said as university college president, she had to be polite, genial, full of integrity, trust, honest, but there were times she had to be ruthless. And she used that word, and I was like, wow, that's coming from Nan? Because you just don't think of her in those terms. But it does raise the question of whether authenticity is about how you appear, or whether authenticity is about whether you understand who you are and are true to yourself.
That and I think a related notion of responsibility.
Yeah.
The most famous photograph ever of Dwight Eisenhower, which all of you have seen, I bet, is a picture of Eisenhower standing in his regular Army uniform, non-combat. He never wore a combat uniform. He never wore a helmet. Because he wanted to make the point that he's not in combat. So he's standing, he's got his garrison cap on and his regular uniform, his white jacket. And he's standing talking to a bunch of paratroopers. And they're all geared up, they're all locked and loaded. They got the black stuff on. It's the 101st Airborne. They're about to jump behind. It's the eve of D-Day. And Eisenhower has gone to talk to them because he has just been told they're not coming back. There are going to be 70% casualty rates for these guys. So he wants to look them in the eye before sending them to their fates. So he's out there talking about fishing and farming and all this kind of stuff with these guys, knowing that they're going to die that night. And in his chest vest pocket, he has written a note to himself that if the landings fail, which he has just ordered, for sole responsibility for this, if the landings fail, he's written in this note, the responsibility is mine alone. And that's a statement he's going to read if things go badly. He had a highly developed sense of personal responsibility. And I think it's more...
If we win, it's the truth. The truth gets credit.
Right.
If we lose, it's mine.
It's mine.
It's mine.
I mean, it's one of the great lines ever of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy rose in Eisenhower's estimation when, after the Bay of Pigs, a classic screw-up on all sides, which Kennedy deserves some blame for. He came out to the American people and he said, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan, but I am the sole one responsible for this. Incidentally, his approval rating hit 90% that year. The American people appreciate it when you take responsibility. A lesson that is lost, I think, on a lot of leaders today. So I think you can be, this goes to the authenticity thing. You can be a cold-blooded bastard if at the end of the day you take responsibility for your actions and for your defeats as well as your victories. That's a kind of authenticity.
Right. There was another piece of that, John Keegan, with whom you're familiar with his war writings, talks about the importance of war leaders. That there is a certain amount of theater that goes into leadership. leadership that you have to inspire your troops. And he goes back to Alexander the Great and the whole idea of taming that horse. But Eisenhower always felt that even when you were really pessimistic about the outcome of what you were doing, you had to maintain a positive front. You had to, he said, I've got to confine my troubles to my pillow.
Well,
I found that very, very interesting.
And they're classic, just to give you the two bookends of this. As a West Point cadet, this is a story he told. They had to box at West Point, and everybody had to do it. And so as he gets knocked down by the boxing instructor, and he gets up all kind of grumpy and cranky and upset. And the boxing instructor stops the match and says, listen, fella, if you can't get up smiling, you're never going to be. So you got to get up smiling. And Eisenhower would tell the story, and he always smiled in adversity. Flash forward, Battle of the Bulge. The Germans have broken through. They're driving towards Antwerp. All of his generals are going, oh my God, what have we done here? What does Eisenhower says? This is an enormous opportunity for us. We're going to cut off the Germans as they pass through. We're going to cut them off, which is exactly what they did. But he knew at that moment he had to project, when everybody else in the bunker was looking defeatist, he had to project victory and smile. He did at the crucial moment of command. And he was not a great commander in some ways. He was feeling his way. He was sort of learning on the job in North Africa. But at the key moments, he knew how to project confidence.
Before we open this, I want to give you a chance to ask a question. As I was reading through your book, there were two comparisons I wanted to ask you about with President Obama. And that is, it has struck me more than once that he has taken a page out of Eisenhower's book and that he's totally against committing troops to combat, and he's trying very hard to wind down two wars and use indirect means. Eisenhower used paramilitary, he used CIA to conduct his foreign policy, and Obama's using drones without having to put troops on the ground. Is that an inappropriate comparison, or is we just a very strangely different men, or how do you look at that?
No, I think it's appropriate. I mean, I different times, different situations. Yeah, so that's an important caveat. That's not just a ritualistic caveat. That is a real caveat. I mean, it is a different time. Nonetheless, they are confronted with somewhat similar dilemmas. They don't want to use conventional troops. They don't want to invade Libya. They don't want to see American army. Having had fought two wars and watching our troops get absorbed in difficult counterinsurgencies or mess, they don't want to commit U.S. troops. They don't want to use bigger weapons either. So what alternative does that leave you? Covert. And drones, in the case of technology, had given Obama a tool that Eisenhower didn't have. But I'm damn sure if there were drones, Eisenhower would be using them. And I feel pretty sure, without knowing, that we are about to enter a kind of a, I'm saying this half facetiously, a golden age for the CIA and NSA right now, because with Iran, I think we painted ourselves, we were in a very difficult point. If you take out Iranian nuclear weapons, you go to war to do it, you can create a wider war, which is just a mess. Straits of Hormuz closed, oil prices hit $400, they're raining bombs down on Israel, they're attacking the Saudi oil fields. I mean, I read these war games occasionally in the Washington Post. Long about week 2, everything's going to hell. So you don't want to do that. On the other hand, do you really want Iran to have a bomb when not only will Iran have a bomb, but pretty soon the Saudis are going to have one, and maybe the Gulf states, maybe Iraq will get one, Turkey will get one. So you'll have a nuclear-armed Middle East with terrorists. That's a great prescription. And maybe we were able to contain the Soviet Union, but a nuclear-armed, a nuclear-proliferated Middle East sounds to me like a prescription for disaster. And if you're the chief executive, you really wonder if you can permit that. So you're stuck. Containment doesn't work necessarily. Taking them out. So what's left? Covert action. And that actually, the relevance to Eisenhower here is he used a lot of covert action. It seems successfully at first. I mean, all of you have studied this.
You wrote a book about it.
Yeah. I mean, the CIA is the high age of the CIA. They overthrew the government of Iran. God does have a sense of humor. Government of Iran in 1953, and then government of Guatemala in 1954. Early on, those were deemed as successes at the time. History historians have not been kind to those covert actions subsequently, but at the time they had celebrations in the White House. Eisenhower gave a secret medal to Kim Roosevelt for his role in Iran, and they did the same thing in Guatemala. Had a secret ceremony, one of those things where you get a medal and then you have to give it back because it's classified. So Eisenhower was a believer in covert, but it turned sour on him too. Failed coups in Syria and Indonesia, and Dulles, and the CIA started to get out of control, and there were internal warnings to Eisenhower. And one of the things that he screwed up was he probably should have fired Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. His own son, John, and this is a long and complicated story I won't get into right now, but you two get shot down because the CIA has been lying to the president, and John goes to his father and says, "You should have fired Allen Dulles." And Eisenhower says, "I'm the president, you're not." Not the greatest defense, but a human one. But what he really meant to John was that his father knew that he screwed up. That he should have fired Allen Dulles and tried to get control of the CIA. But it's not always easy to control your intelligence agencies. That's a messy chapter in Eisenhower's life, and I fear, even though I can understand the need and urge to use covert action now, we're going to run into that word that you're all familiar with, blowback. When covert actions go badly, they blow back on you. And so I think, although there's a great temptation, presidents often have it. Boy, isn't there some secret? Can't the CIA do this for me cheaply, secretly? Nobody will know. Plausible deniability. Isn't this the way, some kind of surgical assassination or something? Sounds great when you're planning it, but in practice, I mean, in the high age of the CIA back then in 1960, 61, they didn't actually kill anybody. All those assassination plots failed. In the church committee hearings, they were called the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They tried to kill Castro about 30 times. And he's still there.
One other question, which I'm not sure the parallel holds as much, but between the past and the present, and that is this form of indirect leadership that Eisenhower practiced, and Greg Greenstein described so well, that he gave the impression it was all hands off, other people were running things, and but he was actually making the calls, and somebody even described it as leading from behind. So I'm just wondering, is there a comparison there to the current president?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people have been disappointed that Obama has not led from the front. He seemed kind of strangely passive, all that talk about hope and change, and yet he comes in, he does achieve a monumental thing in healthcare reform. But he does it, he lets Congress take the lead. The bill is written in Congress. Now, they're reacting a little bit to Hillary Clinton, trying the opposite approach in the first term of the Clinton administration, when Hillary tried to do it all sort of off campus and then oppose it on campus. That didn't work, so okay, we'll let Congress do it. But putting your plans in the hands of Max Baucus in Congress was maybe not so great. I personally, who can be an expert on healthcare because it's so complicated, but there are a lot of problems with Obamacare as it has been legislated and will be implemented. So Obama was pretty recessive about all that. He sure has not taken the lead on an issue that I care about, deficit reduction and debt reduction. He had a real opportunity with Simpson Bowles, his own, independent commission, hands it to him on a plate, basically the chance to step in and do something about it. He totally whiffs at it. I remember being just angry sitting with Osi watching the State of the Union. January 2011, Simpson Bowles was December 2010, I think. Well, in the State of the Union, he barely mentions it. Yeah. And so I felt a sense of disappointment that he's not more aggressive. Nonetheless, it does raise this question of sometimes it is more effective to come in behind. And there's no sort of simple, I don't think there's a simple formula on this thing. You either have to lead out front or have to lead from behind. It's like everything else, it requires judgment.
It's interesting. Eisenhower had his moments of passivity too with Joe McCarthy, for example. I mean, he was really,
and civil rights.
And civil rights. I mean, on both issues, he was. I think they're the black marks on his administration.
And he let the nuclear arsenal get too big. I mean, he is not. I'm a huge admirer of his great president.
Yeah. But one difference is that when he led from behind or led from in opaque ways, he often did give instructions, this is what I want, I just don't want people to know this is what I want. Whereas Obama doesn't always make it clear, this is what I want.
That's an important distinction. I mean, I don't think when we go through Obama's records in the 30 years, we're going to find the same degree of, one of the things that really got my attention, Eisenhower would use John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State to be the pronouncer, and in effect the bad guy, the scary guy. And at the time, the press, which was even lazier then than it is now, thought that Dulles was running foreign policy because he made all the pronouncements. And only when those papers come open did we find on Dulles' most famous speech, Massive Retaliation, which was known as brinksmanship, do we find on the speeches drafts himself, it's Eisenhower's handwriting. He wrote the key paragraphs. But at the time it was all, I don't know, go talk to Dulles.
Sure, thanks, David. I actually have a question about how President Eisenhower's stature as former Supreme Allied Commander, accomplished war general, affected the integrity of his decision-making process once he became president. Because it's always hard to challenge a president when they're in the room on tough policy issues where you disagree with them. I would imagine especially when that president happens to be the former Supreme Allied Commander. So how did Eisenhower go about setting up the decision-making process within the White House to guarantee that he was getting all sides, and that he wasn't just being surrounded by yes men, especially when the stakes were so high with possible nuclear confrontation in Korea?
It's a great question, and I know it's one that Eisenhower thought about. I mean, two couple things on that. One is on the general phenomenon of the Oval Office intimidating people. Bob Strauss, David probably knows this story. Bob Strauss used to like to tell the story. Bob Strauss was a Democratic fixer for many years in Washington, friend of presidents. And he would bring people into the Oval Office to give advice to Lyndon Johnson or Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton. And typically, as Strauss told the story, these guys would say to Strauss, I'm going to go into that office and I'm going to tell that son of a bitch what to do. And so then they'd actually get in the Oval Office and the guy would go, oh, Mr. President, you're doing a wonderful job.
Of course, yeah.
And that's the nature of power. So how do you guard against that? And of course it was an issue for Eisenhower, who was accustomed to this chain of command, which is pretty absolute, and everybody saluted right and left. Well, Eisenhower would build these planning processes where he would allow all this planning to go on. He'd participate. He'd sort of get down off his pedestal. He'd join in the debate. He would actually shift sides sometimes in the debate. He'd keep his own people guessing. But it added to the comfort level of the president sort of down with you, joining in the debate. You may not know where he's going exactly, but that sort of relaxes people to have him be a participant. That's one thing. He was also manipulative. The most famous planning exercise, probably ever, is the Solarian Project. In fact, you probably have studied the Solarian Project. When Eisenhower came in, there's a lot of pressure on the right to give up containment. Containment was the strategy enunciated by George Kennan under the Democratic administration to contain the Soviet Union with a vigilant application of force but not actually attacking. Whereas a lot of Republicans want to roll back Congress. That was the pressure. Republicans were going to roll it back. So Eisenhower creates this planning process, and he creates three teams. And one is sort of crazy rollback, bombs away. The other is sort of limited rollback, and the other is containment. Three choices. He gets Kennan, the Democrat guy, to write the containment piece. But they have a whole exercise. They talk about it. They debate it. They present it. And surprise, surprise, containment wins. All rigged, I think, by Eisenhower. I mean, I don't think it was really an honest planning process. I think this was all set up with the end result foreordained by the choice of who was writing it. But interestingly, Kennan, who was an innocent participant in this, had not been told that his team was going to win. At the end of the meeting, Eisenhower was pretty silent throughout all this, stands up and gives this 45-minute summary. And Kennan writes in his memoirs, oh my God. The guy who I thought was kind of blithering, golf-playing, dopey, bad syntax guy, 1, 2, 3, expertly summarizes everything that's been said, totally understands it, does a much better job of coherently reducing it all to, and Eisenhower would have that effect on people. He would intentionally kind of stumble around, show his bad syntax. There's a famous scene, which I repeat in my book, 1955, there's a crisis in China. Eisenhower's going into a press conference. I should say, he was not afraid of the press. He met with the press every other week. more than any president in history. I guess about 190 times as president.
Since FDR.
Since FDR. So he, you know, he's not afraid of the press, but so he goes into this press conference. His aides are all saying, "Oh, Mr. President, watch out for this, watch out for that." And Eisenhower says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll just confuse them." And he did. Now think of this today. How many presidents are going to be intentionally dumb? I mean, it just flies in the face of everything we're taught at the Kennedy School. You know, if you're smart,
transparent and clear.
Yeah, right. And he was. You can read the transcript. It was totally obfuscatory, if that's a word. And they had some laughs because they thought of the Kremlin translators trying to figure out. So Eisenhower was so confident that he could appear dumb. That takes a hell of a lot of confidence if you're willing to do that. And it is, I mean, you know, even this talk is a compliment to be humble. It is, to me, a great leadership skill. I wish I had it because it is just so important and so counter to, I think, the message that a lot of you get. That you always have to be selling yourselves and have great resumes and talk about how great you are and convince the adults about how terrific you are. I teach at Princeton, and my kids who are fantastic have all these glowing resumes, and they're constantly having to present themselves as a kind of a brand. They've been doing it. That's how they got into Princeton, you know. And I feel like saying to them, and occasionally do, you don't have to do that, you know. I mean, the other thing that always occurs to me, and my wife will testify to this, I'm arrogant when I'm insecure. When I'm fearful, I'm likely to be arrogant. When I'm confident, I'm likely to be humble. That's an important equation that I really observe a lot in myself, unfortunately, but also in others. And Eisenhower understood this. In fact, it's even true of Eisenhower. When he was unconfident, and there were moments when he was unconfident, he could be arrogant. The most famous moment, well, several, is Eisenhower just did a perplexing thing in 1960, August 1960. Richard Nixon's running for president. Vice President Richard Nixon's running for president. And Eisenhower is asked at a press conference, well, tell us something that Richard Nixon did for you, did for the country on foreign policy. And Ike says, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. Ouch. I mean, just a brutal put down. You know, what was really going on? It's so uncharacteristic of Ike, who was really pretty careful about these things, pretty generous and all that. What was going on? What was going on was that Eisenhower was getting old. He was 70 years old. He was sick. He had a heart attack, a stroke. He was taking too many sleeping pills. He was taking a drink or too many. He had been serving his country nonstop for 50-some years.
He smoked like 4 packs a
He
day.
had smoked 4 packs of cigarettes in 1949. He was exhausted. He was finally out of gas. And he didn't like these questions that were questioning his own leadership. The press was full of stories. Eisenhower's not really in charge anymore. Where he's playing golf, he's not in charge. And the questions that led up to that question, if you look at the transcript, are all about him. And in a moment of weakness, he became a wise ass. And the wise assness really hurt Richard Nixon, and really bothered. Eisenhower knew that he had blown it by being a smart ass when he should have been a confident guy. He had hurt his own number 2, and really hurt himself because he saw Nixon's election as his own legacy.
Do you think that there's the difference in time may have accounted for it? And Eisenhower had a terrific record of accomplishment before he became president that could give him a sense of lasting confidence as a leader for the rest of his life, including the presidency. And whether leaders today feel that it's so slippery to be on top of it, so fragile to be on top of it, they therefore feel it gives them a sense of greater insecurity and they have to project as a way to compensate.
I mean, one of the things is Eisenhower's really not a policy prescriber for anybody else because he's a game that only one can play. If you're Dwight Eisenhower, you can bluff with nuclear weapons, but I wouldn't suggest anybody else try because he had this tremendous credibility. He'd been Supreme Allied Commander. He'd liberated Europe. The Russians look at Dwight Eisenhower and they say, this guy means business. You know, he flattened Germany. He's done it before. When the Korean War ended, it was largely because Russia and North Korea and China are looking at Eisenhower and they're going, this guy means business. Look at what he's done before. So he had a kind of credibility that the others don't have. The other thing is, it was a long time coming. You know, he'd been in the peacetime army in the 20th series. Talk about learning how to be patient. You know, he had been promoted temporary colonel or something in World War I. He gets to reverse to major. He's like major forever. You know, for like decades as major. And these dusty, forgotten posts, small, pointless peacetime army, biding his time, denied combat in World War I, has to be unbelievably patient. Chief of Staff to General MacArthur. Learn how to talk about lessons on how to be patient. Imagine being Chief of Staff to MacArthur, one of the great blowhards of all time. In fact, I have this theory that Eisenhower learned a lot of his modesty and what not to do by watching his boss, who was vainglorious and showing off and calling attention to himself and look at me. Eisenhower was watching all that and saying, I'm not doing that. When I get command, I'm not doing that. And in fact, MacArthur was sort of on to Eisenhower, but see Eisenhower learning. There's a famous scene, still a bit hard to describe, but 1952, MacArthur and Eisenhower are on the same stage. And MacArthur wants to be president too. In fact, probably even more than Eisenhower does at this point. And Eisenhower, in response to some question, is going on about civilian control and the need for humility, and the commanders have to take a second step. And MacArthur listens to all that. He pats Ike on the knee and says, "That's okay, Ike. You just keep going on like that. You'll get it soon." I mean, he thinks it's a shtick. And it was a little bit of a shtick. But learn by watching MacArthur. You know, don't be a blowhard like General MacArthur. So the point of this is that Ike has a long time to learn these lessons. They're not learned in a day. It's not like my Princeton kids who got to figure it out fast, or you here who got to figure it out fast. He had plenty of time to learn how to be patient.
Tell us about the relationship with, then we'll go around, the mentorship that meant so much to him in Panama, and how much that changed his life.
Foxconn,
Because it really goes to a lot of young folks today and how you find yourself.
Boy, here he is. He's stuck. Talk about lousy peacetime post. He's stuck down in Panama. His wife hates him. The mosquitoes, fevers. He has to kill. I love this. He had bats. Eisenhower kills a bat with a ceremonial sword. It's just a miserable post with no advancement. And yet, there's a guy named Fox Connor, who had been General Pershing's chief of staff in World War I, who's a brilliant, highly intellectual general. And he gives Lucky Dwight Eisenhower, a personal tutorial where they read Nietzsche, Clausewitz, the Greeks. I mean, a very high-end intellectual. It's a little bit like going to the Kennedy School. You're having your own personal Kennedy School in this guy. So while they're doing nothing in Panama, they spend a lot of time riding horses. He's teaching. They're reading.
How long that lasted? 2-3 years?
Yeah, a couple of years. I mean, it's a long course of study. And he reads Clausewitz 3 times. And he reads it so close. You know, the famous Clausewitz message, which most of us know, is that war is politics by another means. That's not the message that Fox Connor taught. If you really read Clausewitz, I did try to read it. It's like reading the original German. Now, if I didn't have the benefit of the scholar named Greg Campbell who came before me to help me translate it, I wouldn't have gotten this. But if you really read Clausewitz, what he's saying is that wars you can't control them. That wars are mutating monsters. That they get out of control. This idea of politicians controlling war. That's not the message of Clausewitz. It's quite the opposite. But you've got to read that 3 times with Fox Connor teaching you to get past the kind of German complexities.
And that transformed him intellectually. He went from being a mediocre student, he went to command the General Staff School at Leavenworth to become like #1 in his class.
Right. At West Point, he was, I think, top 3rd of his class, but he wasn't a star student. He was a star poker player. And on graduation day, he paid off a $1,000 loan at the Astor Hotel. $1,000 in 1911 was a lot of money. That was his gambling chance. He spent most of his time gambling at West Point and goofing off and smoking cigarettes. But when he gets to Leavenworth, to the command school, #1 in his class. Thanks to Fox Connor.
Professor Thomas, Mrs. Thomas, thank you for joining us today. Your book describes Eisenhower's deep admiration for Lincoln. At HBS, Professor Gautam Mukunda recently wrote a book, Indispensable When Leaders Really Matter, using a filtration method and analysis. He determines Lincoln is the most indispensable president. Do you think Eisenhower was indispensable? Wouldn't Stevenson have kept us out of Vietnam or ended the Korean War?
It's a good question, and it's always hard. It's a sort of counterfactual, you know, what if Stevenson was president? I think that Eisenhower had been honed to have better judgment than Stevenson. I don't know how Stevenson would have reacted, for instance, in Berlin, where all the advisors are saying, hey, send more troops in there and be prepared to have a conventional war against the Red Army. Eisenhower ignores the advice of all his advisors. Would Stevenson have had the guts to stand up to that? I'm not so sure that Stevenson would have been able to stand up to his own Joint Chiefs, who were basically saying, we're going to have a war anyway, so let's have it now. I mean, I hope Stevenson would have been. I admire Stevenson. He was a statesman, but it took an unusual blend of Eisenhower's experience and his kind of quiet, lonely oomph to be able to stand up to his own generals. So I can't say for sure, but I'm glad that we had an Eisenhower in there during these crises who did have that particular inner strength.
So we have 2 microphones. If you guys like to ask a question, why don't you come up to one of these? Thanks. Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Thomas. My name is Greg Cohen. I'm an MPP here at Kennedy School. So I wonder if you could talk about the leadership required to get us out of Korea. I think that's applicable now with the Afghanistan situation.
This is a messy story, how we got out of Korea. The scholars have been fighting about this for about 30 years. Eisenhower sent secret messages through India and Moscow that if the communists didn't back off, we would use nuclear weapons. The scholars have been fighting over this because it's not entirely clear those messages got through. If you look at the records of the Soviet records and North Korean records, and they argue that what the most significant thing was that Stalin died and everybody else was just worn out. My own personal take on this is that Eisenhower started using very heavy conventional weapons, started blowing up dikes and bridges in North Korea with high civilian costs. Talk about being ruthless. This is the guy, remember, who ordered city bombing in World War II, and that was just the whole idea of Eisenhower, the conventional forces, and this kind of bluffing, if it got through, the total effect and the exhaustion on all sides was enough to get us a bad army. But a lot of historical explanations, the more you get into it, the messier it is. The clean story was told, Eisenhower bluffed them and got out. The actual story was more complicated.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Richard, mid-career here. I'm curious about what Eisenhower learned from President Truman. I mean, Eisenhower was a very strong general in World War II, but Truman was his boss in World War II. They had a good relationship during the war, somewhat of a divorce during the '52 election campaign. What did Ike learn from Truman, who in my opinion is one of the best Democratic presidents that we ever had in the 20th century, one of the best Republican presidents we ever had in the 20th century, with Ike in the 50s? I appreciate your comments. Thanks.
It's hard to know what Ike learned from Truman because by the time Ike started writing down what he learned from anybody, he hated Truman. And so he was damned if he was going to give him credit for anything. I mean, the Truman arc is interesting because this is sort of an amazing story. In 1946, President Truman offers General Eisenhower the opportunity to run as president in 1948. Think about this. The president of the United States is going to take a demotion to be vice president if General Eisenhower will run as president. Truman denied all this until they found it in his papers. And Eisenhower said no. They remained reasonably close. In fact, Truman took another couple of passes at it. The question was, is Eisenhower a Democrat or a Republican? Nobody knew after World War II. Finally, by '52, Eisenhower comes out as a Republican. Then the friendship ends, because campaigns are not designed to make friends. And there are some incidents, the incident that sticks in my mind, there are a number of incidents. But one is that John Eisenhower, Major Eisenhower, is finally in Korea seeing combat. Now, today, the son of a presidential candidate would not be allowed to get anywhere near combat. But in that time, they let him go with this caveat. General Eisenhower said to his son, John, okay, you can go off to combat in Korea, but you have to take a pistol, and if they capture you, you have to shoot yourself. As Stalin's son did. And John Eisenhower told me this story. When he got back, he took the pistol and went to the firing range. It didn't work. But Truman brings John back for the inauguration, interrupting his combat tour. And Dwight Eisenhower's mad about it and says to Truman, who brought my son back? And Truman's seeking to show that he's still president, says, I did. I'm still president. And there's this very frosty moment between them, and they don't speak to each other in the car going up to the Capitol thereafter. And then it gets worse. I mean, Truman is bad-mouthing Eisenhower. He and Dean Acheson like to get together and bad-mouth Eisenhower. And then Eisenhower is always writing these unpleasant letters to Truman that Andy Goodpasture would rip up overnight. And Truman's actually spreading rumors about Eisenhower's love life. I mean, very nasty stuff, which of course gets back to Eisenhower. So there's nothing about it. So it's a long answer to your question. By the time Eisenhower ever wrote anything about Truman, he was sort of gritted teeth. He hated him. What he actually thought of him, I don't know. What he thought of him at the time.
I just want to ask you a structural question. You've been talking a lot about character and personality, but it seems to me that when I think of Eisenhower in political economic terms, he's America's first imperial president. I mean, this is when America steps onto a global stage, creates the dollar as the world's reserve currency, puts 1.5 million American troops overseas, takes on global ambitions, etc. And yet he leaves his 8 years in office worried about the military-industrial complex. What happened?
Yeah, good question. Well, a couple of rivers. I mean, life is politics and statesmanship messy. He's a big internationalist, partly in reaction to the right wing of his own party. Isolationist. I mean, a lot of, in a messy, complicated way, a lot of the Republican right, the Republican old guard in 1952, want America to come home again, as the government used to say, and have a fortress America. Just leave the rest of the world. They're mad about losing China, so maybe not in China, but come home again. So Eisenhower is an internationalist. He's been embraced by the Council on Foreign Relations, all these people who are about wise men who are basically saying after World War II, hey folks, we can't just come home. Abel Harriman's expression was, Americans just want to come home, go to the movies, and drink Coke. We can't. Marshall Plan, we had one of the most generous acts, actually worked, and the Western Alliance. So that's Ike is a big believer. We have to be out there that there is such a thing as the West, that there is a communist threat, that we have to preserve the West any way we can, economically, militarily. At the same time, he understands there's a tremendous risk that if you do this, you will create a national security state. He called it the garrison state. And by the garrison state, he meant not just spending too much on weapons, although he was worried about that and fought against that. He was worried that we would lose our freedoms. Fascism is not that far away in 1952. The idea you can have a value system where the military really takes over. I mean, most of you don't remember this, but there's a book called 7 Days in May, written in 1961, about the military taking over, which didn't seem so implausible in 1961. It seemed possible, and actually, Eisenhower was worried about that and was openly. He talks about in his memoirs about driving around. He'd just been made president of Columbia, a brief appointment in between other top jobs in 1949. Driving around, and he uses a wonderful 1950s expression, a 40s expression. He says he's in a brown study, and he's depressed about the thought of the garrison state. And he's looking around in New York, and he's thinking about New Yorkers losing their rights to the military. So there's an active fear of this. He's also afraid that we're just going to spend too damn much on the military. And one of the little-known facts, Eisenhower reduced defense spending in the 1950s. It was a very high level in Korea. Eisenhower reduced it. He did it by gutting his own service, the Army, because he had to spend on missiles and bombers. We were in an arms race with the Soviet Union. He had to spend money on new technology. But he went to his own service and said, sorry, guys, no money for you. And two of his Army chiefs of staff quit on him, Ridgway and Taylor. Furious at him. Talk about being cold-blooded. His comrades in arms from World War II.
My name is Charlie Clements from the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. When you look at the foreign policy issues that he dealt with, right in a row, trying to get out of the Korean War, Mossadegh in Iran, Arbenz in '54 in Guatemala, then really called off the elections in Vietnam and really laid the groundwork for what Kennedy would do in terms of both covert action and advisors in Vietnam. Can you comment some on that? Was that kind of intentionally kind of stumbling in there? What was going on in his mind with regard to Vietnam?
Eisenhower was an all or nothing guy, and he did make this perfectly clear. And his view on Vietnam was, don't go in, or if you go in all the way. Declare war, bomb Hanoi, take North Vietnam. And he said this to Kennedy and Johnson, but he got used by both those political figures because they understood that Eisenhower was a patriot, wanted to support the presidency. So Johnson's always rolling him out to press conferences to say, I stand behind my president, President Johnson, and not revealing that his secret off-the-record advice is all or nothing. John Eisenhower tells this story of when Eisenhower was sick at this point. He has a 7th or 8th heart attack by 1966. McNamara and Vance come to visit General Eisenhower as he's President Eisenhower as he's lying sick at Walter Reed. And Eisenhower says to them, declare war, go all the way. And John said McNamara and Vance couldn't get out of that room fast enough because that's not what they wanted to hear. They wanted to do this gradual, graduated escalation, step by step. They were not all or nothing types. And it's too bad because Eisenhower was not able to really make his case as clearly as he should have. Partly because he was supportive of the president, whoever this president was. Partly because he was sick himself. Partly because he got mad at the hippies and he didn't like the late 60s. He didn't like long hair, and he was always cranky about that. So that made him more hawkish than he might have otherwise.
Well, given the name of this school and given what happened 50 years ago, I figured it would be remiss not to sort of ask about what Ike would have done had he been in command during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I think partly you might say that it wouldn't have occurred. The Russians held him in a greater regard, or at least were more fearful of him. But assuming that it had, rather than Kennedy's sort of semaphore of signaling to them what he was about, how would bluffing, poker playing, have played into something like that?
Oh, I think he would have done about the same thing. I mean, I do. I think he would have looked for a back channel, just as Kennedy, he had a public, resolute facade, blockade, sort of goes to the country saying we're not going to tolerate this. Of course, the blockade didn't really work, and they were getting ready for military action that Ike wouldn't have wanted to do either. He would have been looking for a back channel, just as Jack Kennedy did through Gergen and his brother. And I think he would have happily traded away those missiles in Turkey. I don't know, it's counterfactual, I don't know. But I think it's entirely likely that he would have done exactly what Kennedy done. And he would have been, I think Kennedy was great in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but thank God the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962 and not 1961. Because in 1961, he was still a greenhorn president. He screws up the Bay of Pigs. He gets bullied by Khrushchev at Geneva in June of 1961. But to his credit, to his great credit, Kennedy learns on the job. And some of you probably have, there are tapes of the XCOM. The XCOM was that committee that advised the president during the missile crisis. You can listen to them. And on the 13th day, Phil Zellico used to teach here, sent me these tapes. Oh, they're easy to get. It's so interesting listening to that tape on the last day of the crisis because about 50% of the meetings are taped. So and I'm listening, driving along, listening to this thing. And it's hilarious because it's all middle-aged men of a certain type trying to appear that they're not showing stress under pressure. So the conversation's always like this. We might have to evacuate the Southeast United States. All this kind of low-key stuff as they talk about these horrific consequences until the last day. And all of a sudden the voices get a little shaky and a little tired. And you start to actually hear the stress in their voices with one notable exception, the President of the United States. Now that may be because he was the only one in the room who knew it was being taped. but he's cool. He says, we're not going to have a good war here if we go to war. And he sort of faces up that we're going to have to trade away from missiles. Then he secretly doesn't. But he's cool and steady and articulate and exactly what you want a president to be. If Hollywood was making a movie, they could just play the tape. They couldn't literally, it's much more complicated. But the feel, the tone, the tenor is very reassuring. And that's one thing I like about the guy whose name is on the school, is he was a quick learner. He did learn.
Dan, I think you get our last question.
Thanks. I have another Kennedy question for you here. We have this propensity here and now to romanticize the 60s as this idea of adventure and cultural revolution. And Kennedy himself talked about this as the new frontier and new generation. And here we are in 2012, fresh off of a decade or more of adventure and unprecedented crisis and roil in the world. And do you think that stability, the stability and the steadiness that we value now in Eisenhower, is that a function of leadership, or are we just tired of it the way we were tired in 1960 and then tired again at the end of Vietnam, all this adventure?
No, sure. The mood changes, and what people want in one decade is not necessarily what they want in another. And different styles of leadership becomes sort of in vogue. You see presidential reputations go up and down. Truman, after having been elected, the fact that he was a straight shooter started to look pretty good along about the 1980s when it's perceived that politicians are being insincere and lying and all that. All of a sudden, Truman looks pretty good after having not looked all that great. Eisenhower's having a little moment right now. One of the great hit jobs of all time in history, PR hit jobs, was what Arthur Schlesinger did to Ike and the Kennedy people. Because think about it, how useful it is if you're promoting the young, dynamic, vigorous Jack Kennedy to contrast him as a foil with the old, golf-playing, dopey caretaker Dwight Eisenhower. That contrast, which was largely a Kennedy and abetted by the press corps fiction, stuck. Most people still believe it. When I go around talking to people, scholars have known. That's not true. For 30 years, I didn't discover it. There's a whole generation of scholars have known about the hidden hand. But most people still believe that in the sort of Sleepy Ike picture, because that was useful in the 1960s. It was useful to have the young, vigorous president. But right now, Eisenhower is making a bit of a comeback. He's never going to get on Mount Rushmore, but he's moved up. Arthur put him, I think, 27th when he first did a rating in 1963. I would guess I think in the polls he's now like 11th or 12th. I think these polls are close. For what they're worth, he's moving up on them.
The other polls are worth noting. When over 8 years to the presidency, when you contrast today, when it's really hard for presidents to get to 50, over 8 years, his average approval rating with the American people, 64%.
Yeah, a number that people would kill for.
Yeah, exactly. Two quick things. Susan, I'm curious about your reflections on leadership. Did you hear this, especially about the being genial, but you have to be tough. You have to sometimes be ruthless.
Yeah, I think that this passion for authenticity is a ridiculous simplification in the face of human complexity. You just can't reduce things to this kind of a simple measure of thumbs up, thumbs down.
Right.
And I guess I would ask you one question, because you characterized some of Eisenhower's actions as being devious or playing dumb, and yet the examples you have given could be the reflection of a genuinely modest individual who is simply broadly curious and understands the complexity of the world in the face of one human being's intelligence is an impossible battle, and you have to always be seeking greater information, seeking clarity from others.
Well, it could be like my wife, you caught me in an overstatement. But he could be devious. He didn't lie. He used the CIA a lot. That required plausible reliability, and he could be devious in his unclear to his own staff about what he believed, and hide the ball, or move the ball around. So I don't think devious really is a far-fetched word. Richard Nixon used that word, and I think there's some truth to it. But your larger point is right. There's a kind of a modesty here, and not getting ahead of himself, and he didn't necessarily know all the facts, and was willing to kind of sit back and absorb them. I think he had a highly honed appreciation of human nature and an appreciation of complexity, and that things don't always work out as coolly and simply as you wish they would in intelligence or in any other. I think he had a highly sophisticated view of the complexity of human nature that I think you get from being a leader, just as you did as being the president of MIT. I think if you're in those positions, you see human nature in all its varieties, and you learn to deal with it.
Are we going to wake up Tuesday morning not knowing who's going to be president?
Well, you're the expert.
Are there any big surprises you think we'll understand looking back?
I want to know about Romney's move to the middle here, how that kind of, that could, they may get an elected president, how that sort of happened, because they've been running right, and then I think that's a story we don't really understand or know yet. We have there's stories or inklings about it, but that's something I'm curious about.
We'll look forward to your next book. In the meantime, thank you very much.